Logical fallacies. An introduction. Consider the following scenario. A newly proposed law is rejected because the person who proposed it is known to be a mean and grumpy person. Does this strike you as fair? Think about it for a moment. How about this scenario? An advertisement suggests that people should buy a particular supplement because it has been used frequently by a famous sports celebrity. Should people buy the supplement? Why or why not? Most of you probably felt hesitant to outright reject the newly proposed law in the first scenario, and to say that people should buy the supplement in the second example. But why? It's because these scenarios point to erroneous types of logical reasoning that we call logical fallacies. What is a logical fallacy? A logical fallacy is an error in reasoning. As you learned when you read about rhetorical appeals, most arguments have logos, pathos, and/or ethos, specific types of rhetorical appeals, woven into them. But sometimes people use faulty versions of these appeals, and these are called logical fallacies. Just as there are 3 types of appeals, there are 3 types of false appeals, or fallacies. In this lesson, you will learn more about logical fallacies. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to 1. Define logical fallacies. 2. Identify the 3 categories of logical fallacies. 3. Identify 10 logical fallacies that appear frequently in academic writing and/or popular discourse. 4. Apply knowledge of various types of logical fallacies by identifying them in particular arguments. Before we get started, you may be wondering, how will understanding the logical fallacies help me out with writing a rhetorical analysis essay in this class? Well, when you work on your rhetorical analysis, you will identify the writer's appeals to logos, ethos, and pathos. However, as our textbook points out, a logical fallacy is an argument that appears logically sound, but that is flawed. When you're reading a piece of writing, you would want to know if a writer is using faulty types of arguments, right? Well, this lesson will help you with that goal. As far as using this information outside of this class, you will also become a more savvy consumer. For example, it will be less likely that you'll be tricked by an advertisement or an argument in which the speaker uses logical fallacies. Now that we've defined what a logical fallacy is, let's work on identifying them. Our textbook gives an overview of 16 logical fallacies, so make sure that you've read about all of them. In this lesson, we'll focus on 10 of the most frequently used logical fallacies. Let's start with false appeals to logic. Remember, the strongest argument would be one that relies on good, credible appeals to logic, such as the provision of supporting evidence, including compelling statistics. However, with a logical fallacy like false choice, the writer is attempting to make a logical appeal with faulty material. In this case, by presenting a complex situation as a choice between only 2 options. As an example, someone might argue that either we bomb North Korea or we face nuclear war. Here, the writer wants to argue that we should bomb North Korea, due primarily to its possession of nuclear weapons. However, instead of providing supporting evidence for the argument, the writer has suggested that if we don't adopt his or her argument, then one disastrous consequence will occur. We will get into a nuclear war with North Korea. Why is this faulty logic? Well, first of all, where's the evidence for the need to bomb North Korea? We need more information, including why bombing them would directly lead to our safety from their nuclear arms. Secondly, other options do exist, and those options have not been explored here. The hasty generalization fallacy is another faulty appeal to logic. When someone commits this fallacy, he or she draws a general conclusion that is based on only 1 or 2 examples. For example, in this statement here from our textbook, the writer has seen 2 women putting on makeup while driving their cars. Then he or she has concluded that, in general, women don't pay attention when they are driving. This logic is faulty. The writer can strengthen it by conducting a valid study, seeing what conclusions it leads to, and repeating the study at least once to see if the same results come about and the same conclusions conclusions can be drawn. In Latin, non sequitur means it does not follow. Similarly, a non sequitur fallacy is one that presents a conclusion that does not logically follow its premises. For example, someone here presents two premises. First, that he or she had a funny science teacher in elementary school. And second, that people who are funny are usually popular. However, if that same person concludes, based on those two premises, that science teachers in elementary school should become entertainers, he or she has committed the non sequitur fallacy. To differentiate between the non sequitur and hasty generalization fallacies, remember that non sequitur means it does not follow. Conclusions follow premises, so a non sequitur fallacy must contain both premises and a conclusion. In contrast, a hasty generalization fallacy starts with a very small sample study, say of one or two examples, from which someone draws one general conclusion. Post hoc ergo propter hoc means after this, therefore, results in this. Similar to the non sequitur fallacy, premises and a conclusion are involved, but a distinctly cause and effect line of reasoning is always involved in this type of fallacy. For example, if I offer two premises, one that says I left my house today without an umbrella, and another that points out it rained all day, and I then conclude that it rained all day because I left my umbrella at home, I am trying to argue that X and Y cause Z to occur. That is faulty cause and effect logic. How does this differ from the non sequitur fallacy? Well, remember that the non sequitur fallacy doesn't necessarily involve cause and effect. It just says that two premises can add up to a conclusion, though illogically. And the hasty generalization fallacy argues that we can look at one or two examples and draw very broad conclusions from those. The slippery slope fallacy is like the post hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy in that it uses faulty cause and effect reasoning. But the slippery slope fallacy argues that A will inevitably lead to B, C, and D, wherein C is worse than B, D is even worse than B or C, and therefore A has led to D, in which D stands for disaster. Let's look at the example from our textbook. Ultimately, this statement says that if someone, say John, takes the car out tonight, it will lead to his family losing its house, which is a disaster. How? Supposedly, though it's faulty logic, John taking the car out will lead him to crashing into someone, which will lead to the family getting sued, which will lead to the family losing their house. We can see that each consequence is worse than the last, leading illogically to disaster. Many writers also use faulty appeals to emotions in their arguments. Let's take a look at a few of those next. For example, the appeal to tradition fallacy argues that something has value simply because it has withstood the test of time, which makes it traditional. For example, someone who supports the electoral college system might argue that we should keep it simply because it has been around in the United States since 1804. Traditions tend to evoke emotions in people. After all, who wants to question a tradition that is considered foundational to a country's success? Doing so might be similar to questioning the country's values. And that is what makes this logical fallacy a false appeal to pathos. Another shoddy or faulty appeal to emotions is the red herring fallacy. What's a herring? A herring is a type of fish, and red herring is smoked herring. An article published in February of 2011 by the Chicago Tribune, titled Catching a Red Herring, explains that the red herring's origins can be traced to William Cobbett, a British journalist in the early 1800s. Cobbett wrote a story, presumably fictional, in the February 14, 1807 edition about how as a boy he had used a red herring as a decoy to deflect hounds chasing after a hare. Quinion, quoted in the article, quotes, "He used the story as a metaphor to decry the press, which had allowed itself to be misled by false information about a supposed defeat of Napoleon. This caused them to take their attention off important domestic matters. In our example on this slide, we see that the original argument is about someone being late and not calling to let the person know. However, the speaker then brings up a different point, one about whoever was late not putting laundry away last week. This causes distraction and frustration. But the argument isn't relevant. The emotions involved in the distraction are what make this appeal a faulty version of pathos. We've talked about some faulty appeals to logos and pathos. Let's discuss a few false appeals to ethos. As our textbook points out, ad hominem is Latin for at the person. The ad hominem fallacy attacks the person making the argument rather than the argument itself, suggesting that the person's argument is not valid due to an aspect of the arguer's character. For example, in the statement presented from the textbook, the writer argues that people who support a border wall are wrong because they are stupid. In this case, intellectual capacity or character has been attacked rather than the argument itself. The genetic fallacy is a form of stereotyping. It suggests that one can draw conclusions about someone else based on his or her heredity. In the example from the textbook, the writer suggests that Mr. Santini must love wine because he is French. However, the fact that Mr. Santini loves wine would be based on aspects of his personality that don't necessarily relate to his biological makeup or his nationality. The argument from authority is a false appeal to ethos because it suggests that one's authority makes his or her argument true. For example, in this statement from the textbook, someone is arguing that the 30 years of experience his or her uncle has as a naval officer automatically make his arguments for addressing the Navy's impact on the marine ecosystem strong and valid. As we learned from the appeal to tradition fallacy, withstanding the test of time doesn't make an argument withstand the test of truth. Even people with authority need to provide support for their claims. Arguing that one's claims are valid simply because one is an authority is not logical. Of course, if your mom tells you to do something and you ask why, and she says, "Because I'm your mom," telling her that she's relying on a logical fallacy is probably not a good idea. Are you starting to understand the logical fallacies and identify the different types? Let's go back to the examples from the beginning of this presentation and see if you can apply what you've learned. First, if a newly proposed law is rejected because the person who proposed it is described as mean and grumpy, which logical fallacy is being relied on? Ad hominem or non sequitur? If you guessed ad hominem, you are right. Dismissing someone's argument by attacking his or her character is a false appeal to ethos that we call ad hominem. Let's go back to our other example. If an advertisement suggests that people should buy a supplement because a famous celebrity has been using it for several years, which of the following two fallacies is being committed? Appeal to authority or non sequitur? If you guessed appeal to authority, you are right. This is another false appeal to ethos by suggesting that someone's authority can be used to make an argument associated with that person true. Someone's authority doesn't make his or her statements true or false. We always have to check out the evidence. How did you do? If you missed one or both of these questions, consider contacting the instructor. Let's review what we've learned in this lesson. Logical fallacies are arguments that appear logically sound, but are actually flawed. There are three categories of logical fallacies: false appeals to logos, false appeals to pathos, and false appeals to ethos. Examples of logical fallacies can be matched to these categories. False appeals to logos include false choice, hasty generalization, non sequitur, post hoc ergo propter hoc, and slippery slope. False appeals to pathos include appeal to tradition and red herring. False appeals to ethos include ad hominem, argument from authority, and the genetic fallacy. I'd like you to do a practice activity in which you will create and identify logical fallacies. You will find this particular lesson in the module for logical fallacies. Please check it out and let me know if you have any questions, but you can see a preview of the assignment here. For part 1, I'd like you to view the logical fallacies PowerPoint. You've already done that at this point, but feel free to review it if you need to. Be sure to do the brief practice activity at the end of the presentation and ask any questions you might have. In part 2, find the logical fallacy that you've been assigned based on your last name. And I'd like you to post a statement that exemplifies that particular logical fallacy. In part 3, you'll read at least 2 of your peers' posts and attempt to identify correctly the fallacies in their posts. Remember, if you attempt to do part 3 too early, you may encounter a lack of posts to which you can respond. So if that happens, I'd recommend that you keep checking back until you have posts to respond to. And for part 4, I'll just ask you to edit your original post so that it includes the answer to your logical fallacy riddle. You can do that by simply writing a sentence such as, "The correct answer is slippery slope." And this concludes our lesson on logical fallacies. Please don't forget to ask the instructor if you have any questions.